'Twas the eve before Hearthfire, and all through the Feywild not a creature was stirring but for an elven child. Flitting between shadows cast by the moon above, she sought the true meaning of love. Leaves crunched beneath a pair of booted feet, breaking the silence that inevitably seemed to come with darkening skies and cooler weather. The air around the figure crackled with an energy that went mostly unseen by the uninitiated, yet the strength of it had perturbed others on the road to the point where most went out of their way to avoid coming in contact. If the energy didn't scare them away, then the traveler's disturbing appearance would do it. In direct lighting, one could tell the traveler was a female elf if the hood of her cloak didn't hide the prominence of her shapely ears. Standing in shadow, she seemed to practically disappear. Some thought her a sorceress, casting some kind of invisibility spell. Others believed she was actually a fairy disguising herself as a human, for shadows can hide many things. No matter what, all who came across her understood she was not one to be trifled with. Avora was not, in fact, using magic. It was just the effect of what happened during the breaking. That was what people called the cataclysm that destroyed the barrier between planes, allowing them to crash into each other. Cities fell, societies collapsed, and the people scattered as the breaking brought forth horrific yet fascinating waves of change. That hadn't been but a few moons past. Since then, word spread of places rebuilding or offering sanctuary away from the epicenters of the rifts. For Avora, everything about her world collapsed when the breaking occurred. Her body was changed, touched by the shadows that spilled into Vythael, leaving her skin so pale it was practically translucent. Her mind filled with visions that she could not quite understand, but for one thing, she needed to reach Soren. Ignoring the urge prompted more visions and headaches until she started the journey. Reactions from the unchanged, varying from awe to fear, led Avora to take the less traveled, and therefore less direct, route, though a slight headache persisted because of her decision. It was a small price to pay for some peace. The road, which was actually just a worn cart path, wound through the outskirts of a forest. Trees lined either side of the path with low-hanging branches, a sign of the forest starting to reclaim the trail. Roots snaked along and just below the ground, forcing Avora to constantly glance down and pick her steps carefully, especially after the first one snuck up on her while she had been admiring the myriad hues of leaves not yet fallen. She continued on until she could see between the branches that the sun started to sink. As if on cue, her stomach started to rumble. Her legs ached, still unaccustomed to walking so far. She found a mostly clear spot beneath a sprawling tree with a trunk wider than her arms could reach and let her brown leather pack drop to the ground. Free from the weight, she leaned to one side and then the other, stretching as much as her range of motion allowed. It had been 2 days since her path intersected anything that didn't try to eat her. Despite her self-assurance that it was better that way, Avora couldn't help but feel a little lonely with no one for company but the wind. At first she had longed for her family, but by that point in her journey, she wished for any kind of companionship to make the trek more bearable. As she knelt by the pack, preparing to undo the clasp holding her bow onto the pack, movement caught the corner of her eye. Heart pounding, she fought her natural instinct to jump up and run. Her hand drifted to the clasp as though she hadn't seen anything. When it fell, she took hold of the bow and quiver, putting the strap of the latter over her shoulder, careful not to let any arrows fall. The quiver didn't fit well since she'd had to trade a dagger for it, but it did the trick. She swallowed the small lump forming in her throat and stood with her back facing the tree while leaving the pack on the ground. Avora looked to her left and right along the path where the light pierced through more easily. Nothing was there but the breeze rustling through the trees. Her eyes, once bright cerulean, had faded to a silvery gray with flecks of barely visible purple during the fallout of the breaking. Her hair had gone prematurely silver at the roots. Though the color of her eyes was faded, they could see much more clearly into the darkness of the deeper part of the woods. Had it not been for that new ability, Avora might not have noticed the shadowy creature ducking behind a tree. Avora tensed immediately. Taking in a long breath, she willed herself to relax the muscles clenching in her shoulders and arms. She stayed very still while her eyes scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. She counted 30 breaths before moving again. Without taking her gaze away from where the shadow had been, she undid the clasp at the top of her pack and withdrew a small parcel. After several more breaths, Avora began to think she imagined the movement. "Suppose I ought to be careful of what I wish for," she muttered, finally taking her focus away from the trees to unwrap the parcel. She pulled away the waxy paper to reveal a small meal of dried fruits and meat. Her stomach rumbled again at the sight, unappetizing as it was. With a soft sigh, Avora picked up a strip of meat and gnawed on it. The meat had been salted for preservation, but that only served to dry out her mouth. When she managed to actually tear some of the strip off and chew on it, she grabbed her flask and waited for the meat to wear down into a manageable chunk to swallow. She glared at the remainder of the meal and grabbed her flask of water. As she lifted the flask to her mouth, something in the corner of her eye caught her attention. She took a quick drink, restoppered the flask, and put it away. A large bird, black as night, flew out from the trees, cawing loudly. Avora threw her hands up to cover her head, but the bird swerved into an arc and landed several paces away. Lowering her arms, Avora stared at the creature. The glistening feathers were so dark they appeared to have an almost purple sheen to them, and they looked as soft as velvet. A dark beak jutted out from its head, but it was the creature's eyes that stole Avora's attention. Not the beady eyes of a normal bird, but deep violet and inky. It regarded Avora with an intelligence unlike any she had ever seen, even from other elves. Avora licked her lips nervously and reached for the discarded strip of meat. She tore off a piece with some effort, then tossed it in the bird's direction. It fell just shy. The bird turned its head to the side slightly, still studying Avora. Then it dipped its head once, lowering it to the point where its beak nearly touched the ground. After a moment, it raised its head, hopped forward twice, and picked up the meat in its beak before spreading its large wings and taking off again into the forest. Did it just bow to me? Avora mused aloud. She popped the berries into her mouth and latched the bag shut, then put her bow back in its holder. She left the quiver slung over her shoulder, though. With a final pat against her leg to check that her dagger was still in its sheath, she set off again. Occasionally, the giant raven, for that was what she realized it was, would cast its shadow on the ground nearby, but it didn't bother Avora nearly as much as she thought it would. It was nice to have a companion, even if it was one who didn't speak. The sun continued to sink towards the horizon. As its light began to disappear, the air grew colder. When the sun had all but disappeared, the bluish rosy gold still visible, the path began to ascend in a slope. To the right, the forest extended and also began to rise. To the left lay clearing, but no clear path. Other than the pervasive headache, Avora would have no way to navigate the correct direction. The raven, for its part, landed on a fallen log a short distance up the hill, its eyes steady and staring at Avora. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly, able to see it as it left her body and curled into the air. "Okay," she said to the raven. "Up we go." She shifted her cloak to wrap it tighter around her body, grateful for the foresight to trade her light cloak for one made of wool. What began as a gentle incline up the slope became steeper as she climbed. Avora silently bemoaned her aching limbs, but she didn't stop but for a few moments to catch her breath. Each time she started moving again, it felt harder to continue. After the 5th or 6th time, Avora considered pausing for the night. The raven let out a disapproving caw and flew further up the mountain for emphasis. "Of course you can keep going," Avora said in between breaths. "You get to fly." She made a face at the bird's retreating form, but kept moving anyway. Meanwhile, the not-quite full moon lifted into the sky, casting its bright glow on the path. After some time passed, which felt longer than it actually was, the path leveled out again, but when Avora looked for her flying companion, it was gone. "Typical," she breathed. She hadn't gone much farther when the path split in two. She paused, trying to gauge which direction to go based on the pain in her head, but it remained a dull throb with no indication of which route to take. What she needed was a sign. Something that said, "This way to Soren," if at all possible, but she'd settle for, "This way to civilization." On the left path, which seemed to lead further up to a mountain, a shape appeared in the distance. Avora supposed it had to be the bird, since she had yet to see anything else. "Must be my sign," she sighed. Several paces later, she realized the figure was moving towards her as well, and it was on the ground, not flying. Suddenly wary, her hand fell to the hilt of her dagger on reflex. Upon closer inspection, the figure revealed itself to be a young girl, younger even than Avora's little brother. The girl moved gracefully towards Avora. To her surprise, the girl's form seemed to flicker in and out of existence whenever she was hidden from the moonlight. As she approached, Avora could see black hair that blended in with the dark cloak flowing around the girl. She opened her arms toward Avora, revealing a dark gown. "Welcome, traveler," the girl said, her voice tinny yet strangely comforting. She walked right up to Avora and put her hand on Avora's arm, like greeting an old friend. Avora couldn't speak for several moments, letting the girl guide her back up the path. She wasn't alone. She wasn't the only one who could shadow shift. Relief filled her chest until tears pricked at her eyes. "We've been expecting you," the girl continued, when Avora remained quiet. There was a light skip to the girl's step, almost as though she floated over the ground. "How?" Avora finally found her voice. "Who?" The girl smiled in a way that made the moon pale by comparison, but she didn't answer the questions. The path curved again, ending at the entrance to a cave large enough for Avora to walk through easily without stooping. The girl let go of Avora's arm and skipped into the cave where the darkness seemed to swallow her. Against better judgment, Avora followed. She blinked once after crossing the cave's threshold. In mere moments, her eyes readjusted. The cavern was much smaller than it appeared, with glistening cones hanging from the ceiling after hundreds of cycles of water dripping to the floor. The girl sashayed along the way, seemingly dancing to music only she could hear. Up ahead, Avora could see evidence of old campsites in some of the nooks, though none of them were occupied. A sense of unease filled Avora as she picked her way among the oddly shaped boulders. She glanced up to find she had fallen further behind. Avora realized that what she had thought was a cave was actually a tunnel through the mountain. Outlined against the night sky, the girl approached what looked to be a roaring fire. Several other shapes started to become clearer as Avora stepped closer, all sitting around the fire. The flames flickered in the breeze, letting the shadows play. To Avora's surprise, a few of the figures seemed to disappear for a moment when the light shifted away from them. She truly wasn't the only one. There were others like her out there, others who could shadow shift. She picked up the pace, slowing as the figures came into clearer view. Standing next to a non-shifting figure with bright blue hair turned away, the girl turned and gestured for Avora to come forward. A few steps away, Avora stopped, staring at two people sitting side by side on the other edge of the crackling fire. Both were pale, with black hair that faded to bright white, and both blended into the shadows at times. That was where the similarities ended, but Avora recognized them all the same. The man's hair crested into a wave that partly framed his face. His eyes were paler than she remembered, but he had the same oval face and mischievous smirk, though he appeared exhausted. A woman sat to his right, her hair falling past her shoulders and her eyes pale blue. Her full lips parted in shock at the sight of Avora. "Yrel?" Avora whispered, sure that the firelight or the girl or both were playing trick on her eyes. "Elavie?" She practically choked on the words. The man, Yrel, swiveled his head around at the sound of his name. When he found Avora, the smirk faded into a look of utter disbelief. Elavie, for her part, scrambled to her feet and took a couple of hurried steps forward. She stopped just shy of Avora and started to reach a hand out, but hesitated. Withdrawing her hand, she said, her voice clear and high, "It can't be her, Yrel. Our true sister would have found us after the breaking." Unshed tears burned at Avora's eyes, tears she had shoved behind a dam again and again because to let them out would mean admitting her brother and sister were dead, now threatened to break free and overwhelm her. "I tried," Avora began, but her voice broke. Elavie stared for a long moment as though trying to pick apart a lie in Avora's words. Then she sighed and glanced back at her brother. She stepped aside and gestured to the fire. "Ghost or no, you appear as though you've had a long journey. Come sit." Avora let out the smallest of chuckles, pleased that Elavie had not lost herself during the change. When Elavie stepped aside, Avora could see the girl swaying where she stood. Her face was turned up toward the moon, a serene smile on her pale lips. She made no effort to move as Avora joined Elavie by the fire, but as the three siblings became reacquainted and discussed the events that transpired after the breaking, Avora realized the girl had disappeared only to re-emerge from the cavernous tunnel a short while later with a wooden plank laid out with berries and roots, most of which Avora recognized as the edible kind. The small group ate and laughed long into the night. When the moon had risen high into the sky, Avora sighed with more content than she'd felt in several moons. "Is the food not agreeing with you?" Yrel remarked with a sly grin. Avora nearly stuck her tongue out at him purely from old habit, but managed to withhold the temptation. "No," she said instead. "I was just thinking about how we used to gather around the hearth-fire in much the same way as we are now. After suffering unspeakable changes and undergoing an immense journey with mysterious ends." Though he made light of the situation, there was a strained intensity that weighed down his words. "I think what Avora means," Elavie began, ever the mediator, "is that the hearth-fire was where we shared our meals and our hearts." "Spoken with more eloquence than I could ever hope to achieve," Avora said, raising her flask in Elavie's direction. The raven-haired girl who had yet to provide her name lifted her head from staring into the flames. She looked thoughtfully around at each of those gathered. "A gathering of family and friends celebrating the start of something else. Sindri would approve. So perhaps that is what this festivity shall be called. Hearthfire." She sprang to her feet, to her chosen few gave a signal, and away she flew, for the Raven Queen is fickle. But they heard a bird's call through the night air, and knew inexplicably how the new world would fare.